April 1945. Somewhere in the Netherlands. A small Canadian infantry unit moved cautiously along a muddy country road lined with shattered trees and abandoned German vehicles. The war was almost over, but nobody trusted almost. Every farmhouse could hide a sniper. Every ditch could hide a mine. Then they saw him. A lone German officer stood beside a wrecked staff car, hands raised. His uniform was dirty but well kept. His cap was gone. His pistol lay on the hood of the car. "Major, by the looks of it," one Canadian muttered. They surrounded him quickly, but something felt off. He wasn't scared. He wasn't angry. He looked exhausted and desperate. One of the Canadians searched him while another kept a rifle trained on his chest. "No tricks," the corporal said. The German officer spoke in careful, accented English. "I am Major Karl Weiss. I surrender, but I must ask something first." The Canadians exchanged looks. Prisoners didn't make requests. "You can ask," the sergeant said flatly. "Doesn't mean you'll get it." The major swallowed hard. His voice lowered. "There are civilians and wounded Allied prisoners trapped in a village ahead. SS troops arrived yesterday. They are planning to burn it when they retreat." Silence. Nobody spoke. The Canadians had heard rumors like this before. Sometimes they were traps. Sometimes they were real. And sometimes they arrived too late. "Why are you telling us?" the sergeant asked. The major's jaw tightened. "Because my wife's family lives there, and because what those SS men plan to do is not war, it is murder." The Canadians looked at each other. An enemy officer, asking them for help, and not for himself. The sergeant studied the man's face for a long moment. "If this is a lie," he said quietly, "you'll wish we never found you." The major nodded. "I understand." And for the first time his hands began to shake. The Canadians didn't move right away. They pulled back a few steps, forming a tight circle in the middle of the road. Rifles stayed ready. Eyes kept drifting back to the German major standing under guard. "Could be a trap," one private muttered. "Could be," the sergeant replied, "but if it's not—" Nobody finished that sentence. The major stood silently, watching them, not pleading anymore, just waiting, like a man who had already accepted that his fate depended on strangers. Finally, the sergeant turned back to him. "How far?" 2 kilometers, the major answered quickly. "Small village, church, schoolhouse. They gathered people there." "What kind of SS unit?" "Rear security, not frontline soldiers. They burn and leave." That was enough. The sergeant looked at his men. "We move fast. 2 scouts ahead. If this goes bad, he goes down first. Understood?" The major nodded before anyone else could speak. "I understand." One Canadian cut the rope from his wrists but kept hold of his collar. "You walk in front. You try anything stupid, you won't get a second chance." They started down the road together, Canadians and a German officer walking toward the same danger. The wind carried a faint smell of smoke, and that was when the Canadians knew this was no ordinary surrender. The Canadians slowed as the first houses came into view. No gunfire, no shouting, just silence. Too much silence. The German major stopped walking. "This is wrong," he whispered. "They would not leave quietly." The sergeant motioned his men forward. 2 moved along the left side of the road, another pair crossed toward a stone wall. Rifles raised, boots careful on the gravel. A farm cart lay overturned near the entrance to the village, one wheel still spinning slowly in the wind. They reached the first house. The front door hung open. Inside, chairs were knocked over. A pot boiled dry on the stove, black smoke staining the ceiling. Plates still on the table. "They left in a hurry," one soldier muttered. Then they heard it, a sound, faint, muffled, from farther in the village. The major's face went pale. "The church," he said. They moved faster now, keeping low, weapons scanning windows and rooftops. As they rounded the corner, the church came into view at the center of the square. The doors were shut. Smoke drifted from inside. And then they heard it again. Crying. The Canadians froze. The sergeant looked at the major. "How many?" he asked quietly. The major's voice broke. "Too many." The square was empty. No SS in sight. But the smoke was getting thicker, and something heavy was pushed against the church doors from the inside. The Canadians rushed across the square. 2 soldiers took positions by the church windows, while the sergeant and another man reached the heavy wooden doors. Smoke slipped through the cracks, thin but steady. "Something's blocking it," one of them grunted, pushing. From inside came coughing, crying, a child's voice calling for help in a language none of them needed translated. "Stand back," the sergeant ordered. One soldier slammed the butt of his rifle against the door handle. Another wedged a crowbar from his pack into the gap. The wood splintered. Inside, people were pushing from the other side. "Pull, when I say!" the sergeant shouted. They forced the doors open just wide enough for hands to reach through. Pale, shaking hands. Civilian clothes. Dirt-streaked faces. The Canadians grabbed whoever they could and pulled them out into the square. Women. Elderly men. Children. Coughing hard but alive. The German major stepped forward instinctively to help lift an old woman down the steps. A Canadian nearly shoved him back, then hesitated, and let him help. More civilians stumbled out, eyes wide from smoke and fear. "Anyone still inside?" the sergeant asked a woman who could barely stand. She pointed weakly toward the altar. "Basement," she whispered. The major closed his eyes. "There's a cellar under the church," he said. "They used it as a shelter." A soldier looked toward the growing smoke inside. "We don't have much time." The sergeant grabbed 2 volunteers. "Masks on, quick, in and out." They disappeared into the dark doorway. Outside, the rescued civilians huddled together in the square, wrapped in blankets pulled from Canadian packs. Some stared at the German major with confusion. Others simply cried. Then, a distant engine. Faint, but getting louder. The sergeant heard it too, and turned toward the road leading out of the village. "They're coming back." The Canadians worked quickly in the village square. Blankets were handed out. Canteens passed from soldier to soldier. A medic checked a little boy's breathing while his mother held his hand and whispered to him. The church doors stood open now, smoke thinning as fresh air moved through the building. 2 soldiers emerged from inside, helping the last group up from the cellar steps. Weak, shaken, but alive. The German major stood off to the side, watching. He didn't speak. He didn't try to explain. He just helped when someone needed lifting, or when a frightened child refused to move unless someone held their hand. One Canadian private looked at him and muttered, "Never thought I'd see this." "Me neither," the sergeant replied quietly. In the distance, a low rumble rolled across the countryside. Not close, not yet, but enough to remind them they couldn't stay. The sergeant studied the road leading out of the village, then looked at the civilians gathered in the square. "We move them," he said, "slow and steady. Away from here." A woman touched the German major's sleeve and spoke softly in Dutch. He nodded, then turned to the Canadians. "There is a farm road behind the church," he said. "It leads through the fields. Safer." The sergeant held his gaze for a long moment, then gave a short nod. "Show us." For the first time since his surrender, the major walked ahead, not as a prisoner, but as a guide. Behind him, Canadian soldiers and rescued villagers began moving together down a narrow dirt path between the fields. The village faded behind them in the gray morning light. No one knew what they would meet on the road ahead, but for now, they were alive. The line of civilians and soldiers stretched along the narrow farm path like a quiet, moving shadow. No one spoke loudly. Even the children seemed to understand that silence mattered. Boots pressed into soft earth between rows of early spring crops. The sky above remained gray, heavy with low clouds that made the world feel smaller, closer. A Canadian medic walked near the middle of the group, checking on anyone who stumbled. Another soldier handed out the last of his biscuits to 2 brothers who hadn't let go of each other since leaving the church. At the front, the German major slowed his pace, studying the fields ahead. "There's a drainage ditch," he said quietly. "We cross there, then follow the tree line. It will hide us from the road." The sergeant walked beside him now. not trusting, but no longer pulling him by the collar either. "You know this place well," the sergeant said. "My wife grew up on this farm," the major replied. "We visited before the war." The words hung in the air. A life before uniforms, before lines on maps. Behind them, a woman began to cry softly, not from fear, but from relief. She held her daughter close, whispering reassurances that sounded like promises she wasn't sure she could keep. One of the Canadian soldiers glanced back toward the distant village, now barely visible through mist. "Think they'll follow?" he asked quietly. The sergeant didn't answer right away. "Right now," he said at last, "our job is just to keep walking." The group reached the tree line. Branches creaked in the wind, leaves whispering overhead like the world was holding its breath. They stepped into the cover of the woods, disappearing from open sight, but none of them knew what waited on the other side. The trees closed in around them as they moved deeper along the narrow woodland path. Branches brushed against uniforms. Wet leaves muffled their steps. The open farmland disappeared behind them, replaced by the quiet hush of forest air. For the first time since leaving the village, the group paused. Not by command, by instinct. Somewhere far away, a low, mechanical sound rolled across the landscape, too distant to see, too familiar to ignore. The civilians froze. A little girl clutched her mother's coat. An elderly man removed his cap and held it tightly in both hands. The Canadian sergeant listened carefully, head slightly tilted. "Still far," he said calmly. "We keep moving." The German major stood still for a moment longer than the rest. His eyes were fixed back toward the direction of the road they had left behind. "They will search the village first," he said quietly. "That gives us time." One of the soldiers gave him a long look. "You'd better be right." They moved again, slower now, staying under the trees where shadows stretched long and cool. A Canadian private walked beside the major for several minutes before finally speaking. "Why didn't you just walk away when we cut you loose?" The major didn't answer right away. "Because if I had," he said at last, "I would still be a prisoner, just in a different way." The soldier didn't reply, but he didn't look at the major the same way after that. Ahead, the path dipped downward toward a shallow stream that cut through the woods. The sergeant raised a hand, signaling another short halt as scouts checked the crossing. Behind them, the forest stood still. No voices, no pursuit in sight, just the quiet, waiting world and the long road still ahead. The stream was shallow, but the crossing slowed them down. Canadian soldiers stepped into the cold water first, boots sinking slightly into the mud beneath. They formed a steady line, helping civilians cross one by one. A young mother slipped, and two soldiers caught her before she fell, lifting her gently to the other side. No one complained. No one spoke loudly. Even the forest seemed to be listening. On the far bank, the group gathered under thick trees where the branches wove together like a natural roof. The air smelled of wet leaves and earth, heavy but calm. 5 minutes, the sergeant said quietly. "Then we move again." People sank down where they stood. Some drank water. Others simply closed their eyes, as if afraid that rest might disappear if they moved too much. The German major stood apart at first, scanning the woods the way he once scanned battlefields. But there was no command in his posture now, only responsibility. A small boy approached him slowly, holding a dented tin cup. The major hesitated, then knelt and filled it from his own canteen before handing it back. The boy whispered something in Dutch and ran back to his mother. One Canadian soldier watched this and shook his head slightly, almost in disbelief. The sergeant walked over to the major. "You had family?" he asked quietly. "Yes," the major said. "Where are they now?" The major looked toward the treetops where gray light filtered through the leaves. "I don't know." The sergeant nodded once. Then he looked at his watch. "Time." The group rose again, slower now, but steadier. The path ahead curved uphill through thicker forest, leading away from roads, away from open ground. For the first time since morning, there were no distant sounds, no engines, no smoke on the horizon, just wind in the trees, and the feeling that the next step might finally lead them somewhere safer, or somewhere they never expected. The trees began to thin as the path curved uphill. For hours, the forest had wrapped around them like a shield. Now, patches of pale sky appeared through the branches, and the ground underfoot grew drier, firmer. The Canadians slowed the group before the tree line ended. "Easy," the sergeant said quietly. "We look first." Two scouts moved ahead, stepping carefully through brush toward the rise. The rest waited in silence among the trees. Civilians stood close together. A woman held a folded blanket like it was something precious, even though it was just army wool. An old man stared at the horizon, lips moving in silent prayer. The German major stood beside the sergeant. "Beyond this ridge," he said, "there are farms, open land. If we keep west, we may find Allied patrols." The sergeant studied him for a moment. "You're sure?" "No," the major answered honestly, "but it's the best chance." A faint breeze moved across the hilltop, carrying the smell of soil and distant fields. No smoke, no engines, just quiet countryside. The scouts returned and gave a nod. "Clear." The group moved forward together, climbing the last stretch of wooded slope. At the top, the land opened into rolling farmland divided by hedgerows and narrow dirt tracks. The morning light was brighter here, washing the fields in pale gray and silver. For the first time, the civilians could see more than trees. Some of them began to cry softly again, not from fear this time, but from the strange relief of open sky. A Canadian private adjusted the rifle on his shoulder and looked at the German major. "Guess we're walking the same direction after all." The major gave a tired, almost sad smile. "Yes," he said, "for now." Below them, the path wound toward distant farm buildings barely visible in the haze. Somewhere out there was the next step. They didn't rush down the slope. Open ground meant visibility, and visibility worked both ways. The Canadians spread out slightly, keeping the civilians close to the hedgerows that cut across the farmland like natural walls. Boots brushed through damp grass as they followed a narrow tractor path barely visible beneath the morning mist. No one talked about what might be waiting ahead, but everyone was thinking it. The German major walked beside the sergeant now, both men scanning the horizon. "There," the major said quietly. Far ahead, through shifting haze, stood a large farmhouse and a cluster of barns. One chimney gave off a thin line of smoke, not dark, not heavy, just the kind of smoke that meant someone was cooking or heating water. The sergeant raised a hand and the column slowed. "Could be civilians," one soldier murmured. "Could be empty," another said. The sergeant studied the buildings through binoculars. Laundry moved gently on a clothesline behind the house. A dog barked once in the distance. Then again, normal sounds, everyday life. But after everything they'd seen, normal felt unreal. A woman in the civilian group suddenly covered her mouth, tears filling her eyes. "I know that farm," she whispered. "My sister lives there." The major lowered his gaze. "Then we move carefully," the sergeant said. "No surprises for anyone." They shifted their path to follow a hedgerow that led toward the buildings, staying low, steady, alert. The farmhouse grew larger with each step. A door opened. A figure stepped out onto the porch, shielding their eyes to look toward the fields. For a moment, nobody moved. Two worlds, staring at each other across open land. And neither side yet knew what the other carried with them. The group stopped just short of the farmhouse fence. No one wanted to rush the last few steps. The Canadian sergeant stepped forward with one soldier beside him, both keeping their rifles lowered but ready. The rest of the group waited along the hedgerow, civilians gathered close together. The figure on the porch slowly raised a hand. Not a weapon, a wave. An older woman stepped out into the yard, wiping her hands on her apron. Behind her, two children peeked from behind the doorway. A dog barked again, tail wagging uncertainly. The woman stared at the approaching group. Soldiers, civilians, and one German officer walking among them. Her eyes widened. One of the rescued women suddenly called out her name. The sound broke the tension like glass. The woman ran forward across the yard, arms open. The two embraced tightly near the fence, both crying and laughing at the same time. The Canadians relaxed slightly, but the sergeant still scanned the fields and tree lines. "You live here?" he asked the older woman gently. She nodded quickly. "Only us," she said in broken English. "Farm family. No soldiers." The German major stayed back, watching quietly. He didn't step forward, didn't speak. A Canadian private noticed. "You can come closer," he said. The major shook his head softly. "This moment is not mine," he replied. The civilians were led toward the house, offered water, blankets, a place to sit. The farmhouse yard slowly filled with quiet movement and soft voices. For the first time all day, it didn't feel like they were running. But the sergeant still looked toward the road in the distance, because war didn't end just because a door opened. And they still had one more choice to make. The farmhouse yard slowly filled with quiet life. Civilians sat on wooden crates and steps, wrapped in blankets, holding warm cups offered by the farm family. A kettle steamed over a small outdoor stove. Someone had brought out bread. No one asked where it came from. They just shared it. Canadian soldiers stayed near the edges of the property, forming a loose watch without making it obvious. Their rifles were slung, but their eyes never stopped moving across the fields and distant tree lines. The war was still out there. Just not here, not right now. The German major remained near the gate, hands resting on the wooden fence. He watched the civilians, especially the children, as if making sure they were real. The sergeant walked over and stood beside him. "You did the right thing," the sergeant said quietly. The major didn't look at him. "It doesn't change the rest," he replied. "No," the sergeant agreed, "but it changed today." For a moment, neither man spoke. In the yard, laughter rose softly as a little girl tried to feed crumbs to the farm dog. A Canadian private helped repair a loose wagon wheel while an old farmer pointed and gave instructions with animated gestures. Life, stubborn and ordinary, was pushing back in small ways. The sergeant checked his watch. "We can't stay long," he said. "Patrol routes should be nearby. We'll send word. Get these people properly escorted." The major nodded. "And you?" he asked. The sergeant looked out across the fields. "We keep moving. That's what we do." Behind them, the farmhouse door opened again and the smell of hot soup drifted out into the cool air. For the first time all day, the group wasn't walking. They were waiting. And sometimes, waiting was the hardest part of all. The farmhouse yard had settled into a quiet rhythm. Steam rose from tin cups. Blankets dried over fence rails. The farm dog had decided the Canadians were acceptable and now followed one soldier everywhere, hopeful for crumbs. But the pause couldn't last. The Canadian sergeant stood with the map spread across the hood of a small farm tractor. Two of his men leaned in, listening as he traced a finger along thin country roads and hedgerows. "Patrol roads should be somewhere west of here," he said. "If we cut across these fields and rejoin the main road near the canal, we'll likely run into Allied units before nightfall." One of the soldiers nodded. "And them?" he asked, glancing toward the civilians. "We leave them here," the sergeant said. "Safer than the road. We'll pass their location along." Nearby, the German major sat on an overturned crate, cap in his hands. Without the tension of immediate danger, he looked older, smaller somehow. A Canadian private approached him, holding out a piece of bread. The major hesitated, then accepted it with a quiet nod. "Thank you." The private shrugged. "Didn't think I'd ever share rations with a German officer," he said. "Nor did I," the major replied softly. They sat in silence for a moment, watching the civilians in the yard. Across the fence, the older farm woman pressed something into the sergeant's hands, a small cloth bundle. Food for the road. He tried to refuse. She insisted. Finally, he accepted with a grateful nod. The sky above the fields began to brighten slightly as clouds thinned, pale afternoon light spreading over the land. It made everything look almost peaceful. Almost. The sergeant folded the map. 10 minutes, he called to his men. The Canadians began quietly checking gear, tightening straps, refilling canteens. The civilians watched them with tired eyes, grateful, uncertain, already missing the protection they were about to lose. The German major stood slowly. "Where will you send me?" he asked the sergeant. The sergeant met his gaze. "Forward," he said. "Same as us. You helped save lives today. That counts for something." The major nodded once, deeply. Then he looked toward the road beyond the fields, the road that was waiting for all of them. The time came quietly. No whistle, no shouted order, just the slow understanding that the road was waiting again. The Canadian soldiers gathered near the wooden farm gate, adjusting packs and checking rifles one last time. The civilians had formed a small cluster nearby, some standing, some sitting, all watching. The farm woman who had first come out onto the porch stepped forward. She pressed a small loaf of bread into the sergeant's hands again, as if afraid he might leave without it. "For the road," she said softly. He nodded. "Thank you. For trusting us." She shook her head. "You brought them back," she replied, glancing toward the rescued villagers. "That is enough." Nearby, a young boy from the village ran up to a Canadian soldier and handed him a small wooden toy horse, roughly carved, probably made years ago. The soldier blinked, surprised. "For luck," the boy said. The soldier took it carefully, like it was something fragile. At the edge of the yard, the German major stood uncertainly, cap in his hands again. He looked toward the civilians he had helped save, then toward the Canadians he would now walk with. The older woman who had reunited with her sister stepped up to him. She hesitated only a moment, then placed her hand gently on his arm. "Thank you," she said in her own language. The major swallowed hard and nodded, unable to find words. The sergeant opened the gate. The hinges creaked loudly in the quiet countryside. One by one, the Canadian soldiers stepped through, turning back for a final look at the farmhouse, the barn, the people standing together in the yard. For a brief moment, the war felt very far away, but the road beyond the fields stretched on, pale and endless, and they still had miles to go. They walked until the farmhouse disappeared behind the curve of the land. No one spoke for a long time. Boots moved through soft earth. Wind rolled through the fields. The sky slowly brightened as afternoon light broke through the clouds, turning the countryside silver and pale gold. The German major walked near the back now, not leading, not guarded, just another tired man on the road. Every so often, one of the Canadian soldiers glanced at him, still unsure what to make of him, but no longer seeing only an enemy. Ahead, the sergeant stopped and raised his hand. On the distant road, figures appeared. Helmets, vehicles, a signal flag lifting into the air. Allied troops. A wave of relief moved quietly through the group, not cheering, not shouting, just shoulders lowering, breathing easier. The sergeant turned to the major. "This is where we hand you over," he said calmly. The major nodded. "I understand." He looked down the road toward the approaching soldiers, then back toward the direction they had come from, toward the village, the church, the farmhouse hidden beyond the fields. "For today," he said quietly, "I was proud to walk with you." The sergeant studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Today," he replied, "you helped save lives. That matters." The Allied patrol reached them, surprised to find a column of Canadians, civilians' names written on scraps of paper, and a German officer walking calmly among them. Explanations were given, directions shared. Civilians would be escorted safely from the farm. Reports would be filed. War would continue somewhere else, but for this small stretch of road, something different had happened. The Canadians watched as the German major was led away. Not roughly, not gently. Just the way war handled men when their choices finally caught up with them. Before disappearing over the rise, the major turned once, not to salute, just to look. The sergeant gave a single nod in return. Then both men continued in opposite directions. The road stretched on. And the story of that day, the day an enemy asked for help and was heard, would travel farther than any of them ever knew.